Hello, everyone. Hope you're having a lovely Monday as we are here in Valencia. This is the Arbury Road podcast, Mondays with you and me. My name is Dermot Kavanagh. I'm joined, as always, by Paco Ruzzante. Paco, how do you do?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, really good, really nice and sunny today. So, really happy to be here.
Yes, they're all smiles here in Valencia. We're also
Yeah.
joined today by Dario Palumbo. Dario, how do you do? Thanks for joining us here.
Well, yeah, thanks. I'm fine. I'm also unfortunately cannot be as mild as you are because, of course, here in Venice, I can see the dreadful time here going on. So, unfortunately, climate change is hitting this part of the world as well. So, not more a taboo to talk about, right?
This is it. Well, we've enough sun in Valencia for the three of us anyway. Okay, so later on in the show, we're going to discuss a couple of the key stories from the past week. We're going to talk about Erdogan snubbing von der Leyen at their meeting in Turkey. We're going to talk about Putin's new reforms. We're going to touch on the announcement from Germany that the AfD are going to launch a campaign for Germany to leave the EU. But we're going to start the show by speaking about the recovery fund some more. So, okay, Dario, you're our guest today. This is why you're here. Can you tell us?
Thank you so much, very much. I mean, there's a lot of things to say about the recovery fund as a concept, as a thing. Many things has been discussed and said in the past, a year across the news in every single countries. We had all, kind of conflicts across different, head of states discussing this. I mean, but what is this whole thing and whole idea? I mean, very simply, we had ideas across Europe in many occasions, particularly in 2008 case, where the EU has been trying to set up an idea or project to try to help what has been happening in the past. The problem with these projects, as we know, particularly the one of 2008 with Greece or whatever, they've always been very, very strict in the way they've been giving out these funds for supporting the recovery of potential states, up to the point of producing potentially the opposite effect, as we all know, for the effect of happening in Greece. And the disputable ways to consider it, but clearly these were funds which were being given out only under strong conditionality, and with under very strong consequences for the country. Even up to the point of having an impact directly on the policies which they do. So, but this time actually we see for the first time something quite different, I have to say. I mean, despite being, there's a lot of your skeptics out there which thinks, oh my God, this is another just failures of you. Actually, it's completely different from this. So what has happened is that we know that we've been discussing about this pandemic. This pandemic is being considered as the largest probably crisis since 1928. So we really, the amount of money lost. I mean, unemployment's been rising, sharply in all the world. I mean, this has actually had an effect on the real economy. What the EU Commission has decided from the perspective is that there was no way to actually try to tackle this with funds which were taken out from, markets or, usually this kind of movements in turn of money. So the idea here at some point is that they have to step out directly themselves. So in doing this, they actually put up this entire massive project, which, all of that is part of this readjustment of their budget, the multi-annual financial framework, they call it, from 2021 to 27, in particular, including a set of smaller budgets, one of them, which is called this massive, next generation EU, which are things we know particularly now, which uses funds directly from the euro budgets and uses directly in funds in individual countries. Let's actually explain a little bit how this thing works in details, right? So usually the Commission, I mean, you have the European Union. How the European Union works? European Union, you have a lot of states, which are member states, which each year they contribute to the European Union projects as or institution like the European Investment Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. All these institutions are funded by the EU. What is this EU? The EU is as we all know what the EU is, but basically they construct a budget all themselves across this country. So every year each members of the EU gives effectively some money, which has been taken out from taxation, to construct this budget, which gets refinanced in specific projects through these institutions. What is the important point is that this pool of money usually should not be related to any particular country or specific, project per se. So it should be given out to these institutions, which are sovereign national institutions, and they say, okay, now we need to help post-Soviet countries for their reconstruction. So they fund specific projects for that. Of course, usually this money rarely, unless for specific projects, like, I don't know, human rights projects, or like, I don't know, archaeological, you know, like heritage type of project, they never goes back to the country which are given the money out of. Because usually the project should be above the national level. In this case, has been happening is that we're having that the European Union says, we don't know, we don't want to actually mention how, in a certain sense, this project should be funded. So we're going to give it back directly to the countries. So the country wants their money for some reasons, and we're giving back to them, plus a top up of some additional funds, which will come from what they will receive from the future budget. So effectively, they're lending money. So the lending money they potentially don't have, they will receive in the future. That's how it works. What is the advantage compared to, let's say, things, you know, which has been done in Greece with the Troika, whatever, is the fact that ideally, you know, the majority of these funds should not be targeted to particular type of reforms. There's no request for a country to have what is called the memorandum of understanding, which is something which has been going on for the ESM and all these type of funds which has existed up to now, which they bind the country to actually, you know, do a certain series of reform to adjust their fiscal multiplier, you know, like, you know, debt, you know, GDP ratio. What we're having now is a different thing. Is that the only thing that the funds are linked to is to the type of investments. So they only will, you know, they will give out money only if certain investments be carried out. And these investments include very good things like, you know, the great concept of green economy, digitalization, you know, all these type of things which are directly funded for potentially developing a future as a European Union as a system. And this is a great thing. I think this is really a great thing, you know, from this perspective. However, of course, the only small thing is that we have to agree that, as probably some Eurosceptics have been pointed out, you know, there is a little bit of conditionality in a sense. Unfortunately, we couldn't manage to get to the point that this fund has been given out completely freely. So let's actually be more specific, right? So this massive project comes out to almost 1.8 billion or something. Should be something like that. Sorry, 1.8 trillion, sorry, which will be given out across this from 2021 to 2037. The first component is what we call Next Generation EU. So the Next Generation EU is by there are two things, right? One first thing is this Recovery and Resilience Facility or fund, which will give out 672 billion to countries which they need immediately, right now. The funds actually will be given out immediately this summer from around July, I think. And this 670 billion are actually divided in two parts. So 300 billions are pretty much grants, which are given out, just as they are. 360 billion are actually loans, which will have to be repaid, but they'll be repaid up to 10 years period. So it's a very long period of time for a window. I think the EU is estimating recovering all the fund by 2057 even. So it's like, you know, like a very, very long window, actually, up to 30 years or something. So this is the idea. In addition to this, there is additional little funds which part of this of the actual ordinary financial framework or budgeting of the EU, which will be targeted to security and defense, neighboring, migrations, of course, and it's all additional to the 670 billion, gives out a 750 billion, which we've all been hearing about. So what's happening is that because we have this problem that the funds will have to be you know, requested for particular projects, or let's say, you know, as I said, some of them have to do with digitalization, so green economy. There is a system which each of the members of the EU have been constructing to try to make sure that the funds will actually be delivered to these specific projects. And this has to do a little time structural veto. So basically, the funds will, say the given out of money will have to be voted by the parliament itself. And at the moment, we have before there was the idea of veto, direct one-to-one veto, but one at least, you know, let's say, you know, what we actually managed to get is the fact that now we don't have a veto on one single country, we actually have the majority. So the majority of the country will actually have to vote against a specific, you know, project in order not to, you know, give the money out. So I think this is a massive, you know, like, you know, what we managed to get, we managed to get to a point where, like it's completely different from where we existed before, where we had actually, of course, this, trilateral, system and a memorandum of understanding, which will be, constantly checked. And, for these reasons, I believe, it's a massive things for an idea of cohesive EU. Of course, again, we still have the problem across European countries, which, we're not all on the same line, particularly, we can consider split between particularly two worlds of Europe, Northern and Southern Europe, as we all know, which have, different interests, which effectively have an impact, will potentially have an impact on these funds, But the reality is that at the end of the day, in this exact point in time, the pandemic has hit in many countries. I mean, clearly, there's another small thing you have to keep in mind is the fact that, how the actual money works technically. Technically works that every year, because each country has to give out the money to the budget, then they will ask for some money for these funds. So this means that their contribution will be netted out in a sense. So it's expectable to think that Germany, which is a country which has been working relatively well up to now, will probably request less funds than other countries. And potentially this means that we'll actually, benefit less of this. So it will actually give out more money than effectively will receive back. And this is one of the reasons why we have a lot of Eurosceptics in Germany, like from the new party, Merkel, which has been trying to consider that this is actually been a failure of Germany on the European level. But in reality, as we all know, and probably also Chancellor at the time, is the fact that, if the other countries in Europe don't manage to recover fast enough, of course, the countries which have not been hit strongly by the actual effect of the pandemics will be hit later, because, of course, the recovery of the countries which will, they buy from Germany, for instance, will not going to be fast enough, and therefore we'll actually have a surplus in outflows and in inflows, and these actually will create this balancing in GDP. So it will actually, create a proper effect of recession to a certain extent. So yeah, I mean, as I said, this is the general outlook as an idea, and I think it's a great thing we've done this so far. I don't know. Really.
Yeah. Can I intervene on that, because I'll do a little bit of the devil's advocate in the sense of trying to be the Eurosceptic in this case. I see a lot of lights and shadow in this recovery. Of course, the fact that for the first time we have basically Eurobonds, it's not how they're going to be called, but it's basically a mechanism of European debts for the first time is a great thing. Well, the first thing is, do you think, are we actually going to have this soon? Of course, we are seeing the delays. Even with the vaccines, the European Union doesn't seem to be in control too much. They are promising a lot. So far, the numbers are not good. And this week, the French Finance and Economy Minister, Bruno Le Maire, complained about delays on the recovery plan. All the countries are supposed, if I'm not wrong, to send their plan on how to use the money by the 30th of April. So the first question is, do you think this is actually going to happen, or are we going to have delays and, as usual, a lot of bureaucracy?
Well, as we all know, Paco, I mean, unfortunately, we have to put ourselves in this field as well, because the Italian government is actually on the line of having one of these delays, right? So, but the reality of the story is that the European institutions have always been slow, as we know, relatively slow, but, ultimately, at a certain extent, they've been delivering, because particularly in case of necessities. To be honest, if we see in the history of the European Union so far, there's never been defined in such a short time period, such a high stimulus package, which effectively is a milestone in the perspective of fiscal uniform in a sense. So the idea of unifying, as you mentioned, the idea of debt. I mean, I didn't want to put in this term so not to be complicated, but effectively that's what is happening, right? So because we are putting all the money in a pool, we don't know where these monies are, and then funds are being taken out. So what does it actually mean? This money, as we said so far, they should be only, obtained by the actual budgets. But it's also, relatively difficult to believe that, countries, particularly which are biggest contributor like Italy, which is third contributor to the budget, will actually be able at the same time to contribute to, the actual funds, and at the same time, do the actual reforms, with its own money. So the idea there are two ways here now, and the only thing to say, right? One thing is exactly as we discussed, the idea of Eurobonds. So it means the Commission will actually put up, bonds which will actually will be sourcing money, borrowing money from the public, and somehow. I mean, clearly this cannot happen through the ECB for technical reasons, but this means that the actual Commission could potentially do that. We have been discussing this. We haven't really seen this because it means a milestone in actual idea of fiscal, which clearly some countries like Germany and Netherlands would not really like to see. Why? Because what's happening, as we discussed in one of our articles a long time ago, is that in the moment you issue a Eurobond, what's happening is that this will actually potentially have a yield, of course, the actual return of the value of this interest, which the value of this loan, which is given out, right? So you as a consumer, you want to buy this bond compared to the PTP in Italy because will actually give you a higher returns or a lower return. In this return, right? These returns effectively will be potentially soon an average of the one we have in Europe. But what does this mean is that, from the perspective of countries, means that this is the cost for the country to get the money from you, because it's the interest that the country has to pay you back. It's effectively a loan, right? So what are you doing as a customer buying the European Commission bond? You're borrowing, giving money, you're lending money to the European Commission, and then you want an interest back, which would be the small thing. So the interest is the cost for the Commission or for the country to survive government bonds for getting this money from you. What's happening is that countries like the Netherlands have extremely low interest rates, up to close to zero. Germany is negative. So for this reason, effectively, if you want to invest in a German bond, you are giving them money. So you're not only lending them money, you're also paying them for lending them money. So it's actually, weird that, when this thing is going to come up, the European Commission will actually have to pay returns. What this will mean is that, this interest rate will effectively adjust at some point, and potentially for these countries will actually be worse in a sense, right? Because they will refinance their debt at higher cost they will have now. So this is the reason why effectively no one has been openly discussing the idea of Eurobonds, but effectively there will be something like this, right? Let me also mention another small thing, we're going to be discussed later in more details. Is another thing though. There are two ways to fund the budget, right? One thing is to ask money out from the public, so issuing bonds. The other one is effective taxation, right? So as we discussed, we've seen, the great big bet which Biden has been put up just 2 weeks ago, right? Package of infrastructure and stimulus, which is about $2.7 trillion across the potential 5 years. Well, how they've been planning to actually refinance this? They've been trying to refinancing through the idea of increasing taxation. One of the main points is to undo the tax cuts which Trump's administration has actually taken. So. And it's an important point. And also, last week there was this meeting by the IMF discussing the global outlook, which was a panel meeting which included also Powell from the Fed. They've been saying and mentioning, this is a very brave choice from the US government to actually mention a fiscal reform so important, because imagine a stimulus package to 2.7 trillion, I don't expect it to be fully funded by taxation, but of course, clearly this is a major point. It's a very brave point, but this is true because at the end of the day, you cannot only, ask money to the public, you cannot only try to print money, you need actually something stable coming up, right? And this has not been mentioned by any European countries yet. And the European Commission, of course, we cannot legislate on the idea of fiscal, actions and policies in the individual countries, but this is also an important point, which has to be considered to a certain extent. Particularly, in countries like Italy and France, it's at the moment is a taboo to discuss about tax. But it is an important point. Tax are an important component, and if they are addressed at the right point in society, consider the high level of disequality we have nowadays in our societies, it's an important point. Of course, we don't want to discuss the idea of taxation in a period of recession, which of course would potentially, remove the effects of the stimulus in a sense. But again, it depends where it is targeted, right? So, clearly we have, greatest, multinational companies with this out there. No one has been talking about the tax. We want to open this massive article right now, but it really, these, massive companies are the ones which benefit the most during the crisis. And the coming pandemics, all the, Amazons and these people, they've seen their, incomes plummeting. So this is the idea, these are some of the important components which will have eventually to be discussed.
Yeah. On that note as well, I think it's worth mentioning Biden's bill is so comprehensive, his proposals are so comprehensive that Jeff Bezos and Amazon now are in favor of the income tax because they know the money is set to go on infrastructure. Who needs roads? Who needs bridges? Who needs post offices? Amazon, you know?
Yeah. No, but
they're thinking on another level when it comes to tax in the United States than in Europe, it seems.
Yeah, because let's be facing. I mean, there was a very famous Italian economist, Paolo Schioppa, which one day actually mentioned and said that taxes are a wonderful thing. It is true because tax as a concept are great because when you have a taxation, the government gets money from people, from the public, but then reinvests into something, right? So effectively, and also idea tax, I mean, going to basic of economics is one of the basic concept of way to actually reallocate funds, effectively. So how do you actually have a perfect inequality, when you actually manage to reallocate money from top parts of the society to lower parts? Of course, this in reality, we know it doesn't really work. There's a coordination problem, whatever, but the concept is important. And this is also important in after every single crisis, or how strong the crisis is essential that there is a moment of infrastructure expenditure, right? Because you want to launch the entire economy. And this cannot be done without considering also problem of tax at some point, right? I mean, you don't want, of course, to increase taxation right now, again, on the moment of the stimulus, because of course you will stop the stimulus. But this is something that if you think about 10-year budgets as actually, 5 years budget for the year, I mean, the 10 years or 30 years for getting money back from all these loans, this is an important point which has to be discussed sometime. So it is essential. And again, all these multinational, the reality is that, at some point, everyone knows that these are the companies which have been benefiting the most. They've been benefiting along for many, many years to the tax benefit, the fact that they don't have a physical locations, and this is something which will have to be addressed eventually. We are not talking about going to the public, to the small, craftsmanship around here and say you have to have your tax increase. No, we're not talking about you. We're talking about a different level. And this is actually the level which at the moment is creating the highest level of inequality. Because at the moment, we don't have a way to target them. To be honest, the US is very brave in mentioning this, but again, as we discussed, places like Amazon, they don't really have a location, right? They don't really exist. I mean, some of them are based in Ireland, but at the end of the day, it's only so certain infrastructure. So at the end of the day, I don't know how, maybe, of course, you can always, find a way to tax, say, the actual physical good, but the idea of the tech tax, the internet taxes, something goes beyond the physical goods, right? And this is only something that a coalition of countries can actually do, like potentially the EU. Because, when you have these things, I mean, I know that Ireland is a great place. It's benefit a lot from the fact of being a tax haven so far for tech companies. But again, the fact that these tax can actually be reallocated and distributed across Europe through a program like the one we see in the recovery plan is a great thing. And this is probably why we should start looking for where the money should be, right? Also, there's another thing to keep in mind, and also it was one of the reasons why I don't want to push too much in the concept of bonds. Your bonds are great, but bonds in general are at the moment a potential problem. And the problem is that, at some point, because at the moment, all the issuance of government bonds are supported by central banks, central bank buys, like the UK central banks, everyone. So the interest rates are relatively low and prices are very high, artificial. What is going to happen at some point in recent times is that this thing is not going to be always in this, let's say, very subsidized world. So the price at some point will actually go down and the interest is going to go up. So this actually be potential inflation, which is a fear that many people have, probably not as much as should be. But what does it mean? If you buy today your bond, a 10-year bond, a 20-year bond, in 10 years' time, effectively the price of your bond is going to go down eventually. So you as a consumer, effectively, as a public, you should be concerned as a result of this thing. So as a country, which I want to fund my, again, my infrastructure, I should not rely on the potential money I get from you, because eventually you will have a worse deal somehow. Of course, you're going to get your returns, but potentially there is this risk. And, I should not always potentially put this responsibility onto the public, right? If I do, well, you should do it at least a certain level of the public, which are probably the one I can reach through a tax, right? Which of course will be a higher income tax as a thing. So, yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to leave it there on the recovery fund. We are definitely gonna do a whole other episode about the tax though with you, Dario. That's really it's fascinating stuff, and it's nice to have it explained better. Basically, I know these are some topics that people can find confusing, that they hear a lot about, but maybe aren't explained so well. So, cheers for that. All right, the next thing we should mention is that this morning, I think it was, the AfD, so the far right party in Germany, have announced that they are going to run, as part of their campaign for the September elections, a campaign for Germany to leave the EU. Question is really simple, guys. Can we imagine the EU without Germany? Is there any chance it would work? Well, first of all, is there any chance Germany would leave the EU? I certainly don't think so. Paco, anything to say?
No, it's really complex. No, yeah, of course. It's a really simple question. Of course, there is no EU without Germany. Not only because it's one of the 6 founding members, but because the same concept now historically of European Union and before of European Economic Community developed, starting from the European Cold Steel Community, around the idea of really binding together the French and the German economy. So the idea of creating a Europe around the central, and then Italy and the Benelux countries as well, of course. But of course, we had Germany and France before the European Union basically fighting each other throughout 2 world wars, and even before going back to the Prussian War. So yeah, definitely there couldn't be a European Union without Germany. There could, I think the current system would, of course, crash immediately. You could have something different, perhaps.
I mean, I'm sure that the countries in the north would immediately form their own thing, surely.
And we will have a union of the Mediterranean countries, probably something like that here. But yeah, so the answer is, in any case, in general, like the current European Union would be finished, of course. The probability, of course, I find it really unlikely, because for one thing, that Germany is probably the country which benefited the most from the European Union in the past 20 to 30 years. So actually is probably the country which has more interest in remaining in the European Union, I believe. But of course, then I would say that the second country were the UK, and really few people would have imagined the UK leaving the EU a few years ago. So with this thing, it's always better to be prudent.
From a mindset point of view, you could see the Brits wanting to leave the EU, I think, more so than the Germans. But I completely agree with what you're saying. No one.
See what Dario thinks. We were there when there was Brexit, so.
I woke up on one morning, will not believe, actually, because I even looked at the betting agencies the day before, and actually they even got it wrong. Usually they get it right. Yeah. So no, but to be honest, I mean, in the case of Germany, we have a different story, because of course, typical, these parties, your skepticist party, of course, promote anything they want. I mean, clearly we have 3 points here. One of them, of course, Paco will talk more about me, because I'm a more technical person, but clearly the actually, attitude of the Germans towards politics is much more different than the Brits. So, and even in sense of activism, in involvement in actual politics, even in particular in actually the commitments to what they do. So we have actually a reversal case in the case of the UK, because of course what happened with Farage, and of course all this massive setting, which people which never voted, effectively just appeared out of nowhere without understanding what they were voting for. So it was a clear mislead voting. But let's think about actual numbers and things. So Germany is the biggest contributor to the EU budget. This is true. But at the same time, the contribution which has been given in foreign export through the existence of common currencies is actually being, in many studies and understanding of how much they've been benefited across the years. It clearly doesn't make any sense from their perspective to leave. But most importantly, things we haven't discussed is that what would be Germany without the EU, but not in the EU, in the world? So in a world where we have these massive countries like China, India, the Brits was at the time, US growing up, and these are actually becoming. We know that in 5 years, China will actually overcome the GDP of the US. So we have the massive, like producer. Plus also, the whole system of production, whole system of services changed now because, we have, when we want to source worker for like, 1/3 of the activities we do happens online, particularly now we are in the pandemic, we've seen this. We don't necessarily rely on our own, yard. We don't look at our people and looking at our worker. We actually look at source for workers from everywhere in the world. So what is the perspective in a 20 years time of a Germany which wants to be on its own, alone against this massive, countries and multinational exist out there? What is the trade power that Germany could have? So UK has always been very brave because again, UK effectively, it has a very strong influence, of course, through always had its currency and always these effect of exports of services in a sense, particularly financial one. And it's been a brave choice to try to, leave. We don't know the outcomes of that, the outcome of Brexit yet. Now everything has been dragged with the existence of the COVID pandemics, but we'll see. The prime minister there is very optimistic, as we've seen all along, and he wanted to go on with the plan, all the way through this year. But we'll see, right? So there's the other thing. I mean, the guy has been very optimistic in many things, particularly this vaccination things that has been going on, right? Which also, by the way, is an important point for the recovery. It's important that all these things we'll be discussing, funds, recovery, whatever, will actually go forward in the way we go if we actually have a proper recovery. Because again, if things gets worse, things will, potentially we don't have enough money as a buffer to solve it, right? So it's important vaccination will actually be carried out in the way it should be. But in the UK, they've done this kind of like massive, like bet of trying to vaccinating. Now we have what 50 million people which have been vaccinated so far, or something like that. So sorry, 40 million people. So by only one dose, right? So we don't know what's going to be the effect of that, right? So hopefully, again, these things will work for them. I really wish it. But again, what we know about this government is that, in the UK, surely this will be remembered as a government which has been the most risky one. So across all the one we've seen so far in the choices, including the Brexit case. So back to the Germany point of integration, I really strongly believe that, there's more.
Also, if I can add to that, also another big difference, of course, is the parliamentary system and the political system, like in the sense of electoral even system. Germany, of course, like, in the UK, you have this system, which I find crazy, of the first past the post.
Yeah.
It used to work perhaps once, but now it's really not representative. And you could see it in the case of the UKIP, for example. They had a big consensus in the country, but really few seats. And that sort of increased the anger, I find, of part of the British population. In Germany, it's not like this. No, like in Germany, we have a more mainly proportional system. We have a gross coalition. We had a gross coalition for the past basically 10 years. So like I see really unlikely that the AfD have numbers to actually try to seriously propose, like they should basically become the first party, and even then wouldn't be guarantee of actually being able to push such a leaving the EU.
Yeah, I don't see it. Don't see it developing, but you never know. We'll have to keep an eye on it. All right, our next story is about another German. This time it's von der Leyen, the Commission president. She had a bad week. She had a bad event in Turkey. For those of you who didn't see what happened in Turkey, von der Leyen and Charles Michel went to speak. Well, at least officially, they were there to speak about women's rights and human rights in general. When they arrived into the room to do the press conference of the handshake or whatever, Erdogan has put 2 seats for the 2 men. It's complete disrespect for women. Charles Michel didn't help himself. He just stood there looking like an idiot, made himself look almost as bad as Erdogan. It's more than disrespecting women, which it definitely is. It's Erdogan, much like Putin, it seems, acting with impunity because these guys, these old school, let's call them strongmen leaders, they don't value the EU's power. Erdogan knows we need Turkey to keep housing refugees before they come into Europe. We know Turkey takes more refugees than Europe anyway. So the question I have for the two of you, I'm going to direct this one at you, Paco. do you think people like Erdogan and Putin value the EU and soft power at all? Do they care? Or do you think the EU leaders in particular are naive to think that people like Putin and Erdogan care about human rights, women's rights, this kind of stuff?
So, well, I'll start by calling them more than old-style leader for what they are. That, in my opinion, is dictators, as the Italian Prime Minister Draghi said this week. The comment was not that good because it told. Actually, the position of Draghi is quite interesting, I think, to talk about your question. He said that Erdogan was a dictator, but a dictator we need. We need because we need to protect economic interests, which was a really bad choice in communication, I think, because he managed at the same time to piss off the Turkish, all Turkey and the Turkish ambassador who left the country, and also to annoy those who are in favor of human rights, because of course, I think this has always been one of the weaknesses of the European Union, no? The lack of a political mandate, a strong political mandate, which is essential when you want to protect and defend human rights. And in the end, the European Union needs to be this. It cannot be only an economic union. We are here, first of all, to protect human rights and a clear vision of society and of the world as well. Now, Putin and Erdogan, the answer is honestly, the European Union, if it's united, if it's political as a cohesion, is not the case, I think, that has been attacked by many parts in the past, 20, 30 years. It's probably the strongest actor together with the US in international scale. Overall, could be the first economy, basically, now with that the UK left. Of course, you can't do that. You can't just add one economy to the other. But if united, the economic and political power is incredible. So I think, as much as they want to pretend and they act like they disrespect the EU, I think they kind of see that in the future the EU could play a role where they could would basically be impossible for them to oppose the European Union, to not to take into account at least this also in terms of human rights.
How about though? I mean, so in case people were unaware as well, Putin just passed a load of new laws that were voted on last summer, where he can do 2 more 6-year terms. He can stay in power till 2036. He's also got immunity from investigation and prosecution for all former presidents. So, I mean, do you think? I mean, I don't know. If I'm the EU right now, if I'm the EU leaders, I'm really worried. You're looking at Putin until 2036. His influence is still really strong in Eastern Europe, crawling into Central Europe. He's been able to get even more leverage now because of the whole vaccine mess. You've got Erdogan in Turkey, who, as far as I can see, he doesn't value the soft power, the political power of the EU. He believes in real, tangible strength on the ground and in the air and in the sea, which he has, that the EU doesn't have to such an extent. Dario, I'm interested to get your opinions on this. If you're the EU leaders right now, how are you feeling about the proximity to both Erdogan and Putin for the foreseeable future?
Well, Dermot, the idea is, well, simple, but, dreadful. I mean, the reality is that, we all, outraged about what we've seen, right? We all outraged about, we keep being outraged every day about what we see happening in Turkey and happening in Russia. Reality is that, is there really this political power we can actually do something about it? So let's actually say it in the perspective. The reality of the problem is that majority of the country in EU, particularly southern countries like ours, are not, energy independent by these countries. And one is the biggest problem is exactly this, right? So one of the problems, besides of course the fact we have now of the migrants, and of course we need, there's this idea that we need effectively, like Erdogan to keep at bay the migrants and everything, but the idea is, in fact, it's a long-term process of why we need Russia, why we need, this, Turkey, we need particularly for energy reasons. So if ideally we would be energy independent from this country, particularly Russia, this potentially, will increase our bargaining power. And so, of course, we're not going to be as much dependent. We're not going to need, as much time as would be the case. And back to the point, I mean, of course, it's a bit idealistic, but ideally, if effectively a plan like this one, which talks about renewable energies, trying to focus on a different source of energy power, which we'll actually use instead of the one we originally had, like gas and oil, for instance, will actually give us the opportunity of potentially getting to a point where we are actually energy independent, and potentially we have a different weights in our negotiations with them. That's very important. Of course, I don't think about, there's lobbies which, of course, want this to be happening. But the reality, I mean, this push forward which has been done in, the European Commission with this rigid reform we've seen is a mindset towards this as well. I mean, the reality is that we have to be realistic. Today, we can be outraged as we want, but effectively there is a bargaining power which we have to take into account, which is dreadful to hear, but it's true. So how to overcome it? Well, we have to think about a world where we don't need it.
I couldn't have put it any better myself. All right, I think we're going to leave it there for the night. Dario, thanks a million for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure. And if you think you're finished, think again, because you are coming back to talk about tax very, very soon.
Yeah, we will at some point, definitely. No worries.
All right, perfect. Paco, thanks as always.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
We will be back on Friday with the next edition of the podcast. Have a nice evening.